The war had raged for years. Humanity against the Zarin Empire, two vastly different species locked in an endless cycle of violence and mistrust. Captain Jackson Riker, a seasoned war hero, had seen enough death to last 10 lifetimes. He stood at the front lines of humanity's last stronghold, where whispers of an armistice began to rise like a flicker of hope in the darkness. No one was sure how it would come about, but there were talks. Talks of peace. It was all too sudden, too much of a risk. Then came the offer, one that seemed so absurd, it felt like the universe was mocking them. To seal the peace, Jackson, one of Earth's finest soldiers, would marry Princess Lysara of the Zarin Empire. It would be a marriage of convenience, a symbolic union designed to show the world that their two peoples could come together. No one truly expected the union to be real, least of all Jackson. It was all just politics, at least that's what he thought. He had heard of the princess, of course, a sharp-minded ruler, fiercely protective of her empire and known for her cold demeanor. Her name was whispered in hushed tones across the universe, her political savvy unmatched. To Jackson, she was just another face in a long list of political pawns, and he had no intention of letting this charade change anything in his life. But there he was, standing before the alien council, his mind racing. His commander had given him little choice. "It's for the greater good, Captain," he had been told. "One symbolic marriage will end the war. Millions will live because of this." No one had asked Jackson if he was ready to give up his freedom to be a pawn in a galaxy-spanning game of chess. But duty was duty, and what choice did he have? He was a soldier. His personal feelings didn't matter. As the ceremony approached, Jackson braced himself for what felt like an unthinkable task. The day arrived with little fanfare, a somber gathering of representatives from both sides. Jackson was dressed in the finest formal attire humanity had to offer, though it felt more like a costume than a uniform. He could hear the murmurs of the Zarin officials as they waited for their princess to appear. The door opened, and there she stood, Princess Lysara. Tall and regal, with a presence that commanded attention without even trying. Her golden eyes swept the room, calculating and cold. There was no warmth in her gaze, no emotion. It was a gaze that could freeze anyone in their tracks. Jackson's heart skipped a beat, but not out of admiration. It was the sharpness of her stare that unsettled him, as if she could see straight through him. She stepped forward, and though she did not smile, her posture was elegant, a perfect example of the power she held. The room fell silent as the officiator began the ceremony. Jackson's mind wandered. He knew this was a political move. He didn't have to love her, and she didn't have to love him. This was just a necessary step to bring an end to the war. They exchanged vows. Brief, formal words meant to bind two leaders, not two lovers. But as the ceremony concluded, Jackson couldn't help but feel the weight of it all. There was no turning back now. When it was over, he expected a swift return to their separate worlds. But something shifted. The words of the treaty had been spoken, but there was still much more to be done. Jackson couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the princess, cold and distant as she appeared, was hiding something. She wasn't as easy to read as the battlefield. And that uncertainty, that unspoken tension, was only the beginning. Days turned into weeks, and what was meant to be a temporary formality between Captain Jackson Riker and Princess Lysara became a strange new reality. The early days of their marriage were filled with awkward silence and cold formalities. Jackson had been prepared for the idea that they would barely speak, that they would live in separate worlds under the same roof. It was just for show, after all. But he hadn't anticipated how exhausting the pretending would be. He found himself spending more time in meetings and diplomatic talks than he had ever expected, and even when he returned to the royal palace, there was no escape from the weight of the situation. Lysara was everywhere. She wasn't just a princess of the Zarin Empire. She was a force to be reckoned with. She ruled with a quiet, icy authority that everyone around her respected, even feared. She rarely spoke to Jackson directly, but her presence was felt in every room they occupied. When they had to attend public events, she stood by his side as if nothing had changed, her face a mask of politeness. To the outside world, they were the perfect united couple. But behind closed doors, Jackson could feel the tension growing. He wasn't sure if it was the constant surveillance of their every move, or if it was just the unspoken understanding that they were two people from vastly different worlds, pretending to be something they weren't. There were moments when Jackson would catch her gaze, and for a brief second, he would see something more than just a political leader, something almost human. But it always disappeared quickly, leaving behind that same cold, impenetrable stare. He had grown used to her silence, her distance. He expected it. After all, she had her own empire to protect, her own people to lead. She didn't need a marriage to a human soldier to complicate things. But for some reason, the longer they spent together, the more Jackson wondered about her. He began noticing the small things, the way her jaw tightened when someone mentioned her family, or how she would sometimes sigh deeply when she thought no one was watching. It was clear she wasn't as unfeeling as she appeared. Lizara, for her part, had no desire to engage with Jackson more than necessary. To her, this marriage was a strategic move to secure the peace, and that was all. She had been trained her entire life to keep her emotions in check, to always put her duty first. But even she couldn't deny that something about Jackson's presence stirred something inside her. He wasn't like the politicians and nobles she was used to dealing with. He was different, brave, honest, and unafraid to speak his mind. At first, she had dismissed him as just another soldier with a simple view of the world. But now, after seeing him navigate the complexities of the royal court and remain unbroken by the pressures placed on him, she couldn't help but feel a strange respect for him. Yet, Lizara would not let herself feel too much. She couldn't afford to. Every time she caught herself thinking about the man she was married to, she reminded herself that this union was nothing more than a political maneuver. There would be no love. There would be no real bond. They were two strangers, each playing a role in a larger game. The empire, her people, demanded her full attention. And yet, as she sat in her private chambers late into the night, staring out at the distant stars, a small voice whispered in the back of her mind, "What if there could be more?" But that was a question Lizara had no intention of answering, not now, and not ever. She had sacrificed too much to let something like feelings disrupt her focus. As the days dragged on, their marriage became a silent war of its own. Jackson, no matter how much he tried to avoid it, found himself drawn into her world, whether he wanted to be or not. And Lizara, she found herself questioning if peace was worth the price she had paid. What had started as a simple, cold union of necessity was beginning to stir something far more complicated. Weeks into their uneasy marriage, Captain Jackson Riker found himself sinking deeper into the web of Zerin politics. He had expected a few formal meetings, a handful of public events, and then a return to his military life. Instead, he was thrust into a world of endless meetings, long-winded debates, and endless discussions about the future of the war-torn galaxy. It wasn't just the Zerin who were involved. The leaders of multiple species were now looking to Jackson for guidance, as if he had somehow become an ambassador, a symbol of peace. It wasn't what he wanted. He had fought in the war, not for political gains, but for survival. Yet here he was, sitting across from diplomats, pretending to understand their delicate dance of power and politics. At the heart of it all was Princess Lizara. Despite their arrangement, she was still the one who commanded the room. She never raised her voice, never showed emotion. Yet every word she spoke carried the weight of her empire. And Jackson couldn't help but admire her in spite of himself. She had grown into a brilliant strategist during the war, but in these meetings, her brilliance was on full display. Every decision she made, every alliance she proposed, was carefully calculated, and she always seemed 10 steps ahead of everyone else. But there was something about her that didn't sit right with Jackson. She seemed to be hiding behind that cold exterior, using her intelligence as a shield to protect something deeper, something more vulnerable. The royal palace, once a beautiful symbol of Zerin wealth and power, now felt like a prison to Jackson. The golden walls, the vast halls, the never-ending corridors, it was all too much. He felt the weight of it pressing down on him at every turn, and the more he tried to escape, the more he found himself pulled back into Lysara's world. No matter how distant she tried to remain, they were bound together by their shared duty, and the pressure of their roles was beginning to crack his resolve. It wasn't just the politics that wore on him. It was the knowledge that Lysara had her own empire to protect, her own plans for the future, none of which seemed to involve him. He was a soldier, a tool for peace, nothing more. Yet there were moments when he caught her glancing at him from across a room, her golden eyes searching, as though trying to decipher something hidden beneath his hardened exterior. And in those fleeting moments, Jackson couldn't help but wonder if she saw him as more than just a political pawn. But those moments were rare and quickly buried beneath her icy demeanor. Meanwhile, Lysara herself was beginning to feel the weight of the crown pressing down on her in ways she hadn't expected. The empire had always been her first priority, but the political intrigue that came with this marriage, with this alliance, was far more exhausting than she had imagined. The Zerin Council was constantly watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake, waiting for her to show weakness. She had spent her entire life hiding her emotions, burying everything beneath a mask of authority, but even she couldn't escape the consequences of this arranged marriage. In private, Lysara would sometimes let down her guard, but only for brief moments. As much as she wanted to believe this alliance was just a temporary necessity, she found herself drawn to Jackson. His honesty, his rawness, were so unlike the people she had known her entire life. But that was the problem. He was a human, a soldier, nothing more. There could be no room for personal feelings, not when her people depended on her. One night, after a particularly grueling diplomatic session, Lysara found herself alone in her chambers. The stars outside her window twinkled coldly, reminding her of the vastness of the universe, and yet here she was, trapped in a world that no longer felt like her own. She had sacrificed so much for the sake of her empire, but for the first time, she wondered if it had all been worth it. Could there ever be a way for peace and love to coexist in a galaxy like theirs, or was it simply impossible? As Jackson lay awake that night in his own quarters, he couldn't help but think about Lysara as well. The war had ended, but the battles inside both of them were just beginning. The tension between Captain Jackson Riker and Princess Lysara was reaching a breaking point. With every passing day, the political games grew more dangerous, and their once pretend marriage was becoming more real than either of them had ever anticipated. Jackson, caught in the whirlwind of Zerin court politics, struggled to keep his footing. Every conversation felt like walking on a razor's edge. Every decision could tip the balance of power in ways neither side was ready for. But for Lysara, the stakes were even higher. Her enemies were growing bolder, and it was clear the threat to her life and the fragile peace they had built was only just beginning. The royal palace, with its towering walls and luxurious halls, now felt like a maze of danger. Jackson had learned to be cautious, his senses always alert to the subtle signs of danger around him. But nothing could have prepared him for the events of that fateful night. It had started like any other evening. He and Lysara had attended another political gathering, one of many since the so-called marriage, a banquet in honor of the fragile peace that held the galaxy together. The room had been filled with politicians, diplomats, and military leaders, all eager to push their own agendas. Lysara had remained as composed as ever, her regal posture a shield against the whispers of those who doubted her leadership. Jackson, as usual, stood by her side, trying his best to play the role of the supportive husband, but his mind was always elsewhere. As the night wore on, however, things began to take a turn. The atmosphere shifted from celebratory to tense as a group of high-ranking officials began to argue over details of the peace treaty. Jackson noticed it first, a subtle shift in the room, the way some of the diplomats were eyeing each other with distrust. He didn't know what was happening, but he could sense the undercurrent of danger in the air. Then, without warning, chaos erupted. A loud crash sounded from the balcony, and before anyone could react, a figure leaped from the shadows, aimed directly at the princess. Jackson's instincts kicked in. In one fluid motion, he moved between Lazara and the would-be assassin, drawing his blaster with expert precision. He fired, taking down the assailant before anyone could fully process what was happening. The room erupted into screams and confusion, but Jackson was already moving, pulling Lazara out of the chaos. He wasn't sure if she was more shocked by the attack or by the fact that he had saved her life, but there was no time for questions. They rushed through the palace halls, heartbeats racing, with guards and palace staff trailing behind them. But Jackson knew it wasn't enough. Whoever had sent the assassin would not stop there. They had to get out, and fast. Jackson had no idea who could be behind this, but the truth was clear. Someone wanted Lazara dead, and they weren't going to stop until they succeeded. As they sprinted through the palace, the sound of footsteps grew louder, more assassins coming from every direction. They were being hunted. Lazara, usually composed and calm, was now running for her life, her face filled with a mix of disbelief and fear. Jackson couldn't help but glance at her. This woman, who had seemed so untouchable, was now as vulnerable as anyone else. "Stay close," Jackson ordered, his voice sharp. He knew that the only way they were going to make it out alive was by staying together. He had never imagined that his life would come to this, running through dark corridors with a princess in tow, trying to escape assassins sent by enemies who were still unknown. But there was no time for doubts now. As they rounded a corner, they were met with more resistance. Jackson fired again, but it was clear that this wasn't going to be enough. They needed a plan, but the only plan he had was to get them out alive, and that meant finding the nearest escape route before the palace guards failed them. Lazara, breathing heavily, turned to Jackson. "Where do we go now?" she asked, her voice shaky but still strong. She wasn't used to being vulnerable, and the fear in her voice was a reminder that even the most powerful could be brought low. "We get out of here," Jackson said firmly, determination setting in, "and we figure out who did this later." As they fled deeper into the heart of the palace, Jackson couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this was only the beginning. Whoever was behind this attack had plans far more dangerous than they had yet realized. The night after the assassination attempt, the palace was a far cry from the vibrant, bustling place it once was. The echoes of the chaos still hung heavy in the air. The royal halls, usually so full of life, were eerily silent. Guards were stationed at every entrance, and the usual sense of security had turned into an all-consuming vigilance. Captain Jackson Riker could feel the weight of the palace's tension, but he was no longer focused on the politics of it all. His mind was on one thing: Princess Lazara. She had barely spoken since the attack. She was a leader, a ruler, and yet Jackson had seen her for the first time as just a person, vulnerable, frightened, and unsure. They hadn't had much time to talk, but as he sat in the quiet of his room, he couldn't help but replay the moments of that escape. He could still hear her voice in his mind, shaken but steady enough to ask, "Where do we go now?" Jackson had tried to reassure her, but truthfully, he didn't know where they could go. The danger was far from over. If anything, it was just beginning. He couldn't help but wonder who would want Lazara dead. It had to be more than just a random assassination attempt. The Zerrin Empire was vast, and there were many who would want to see her fall from power. But Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about politics. It felt personal. The next morning, Lazara called for a meeting. It was rare for her to request something like this, and Jackson was unsure of what it meant. He had been watching her since the attack, and she hadn't let her guard down, not even once. But today, she seemed different. There was something in the way she carried herself, a quiet strength that radiated even in the face of fear. She wasn't just the princess anymore. She was someone who had lived through a crisis, someone who understood the stakes better than anyone. The room was dimly lit, the only sounds coming from the soft hum of the palace's ventilation system. Lizara stood at the head of the table, her golden eyes scanning the group of officers and diplomats before her. Jackson stood off to the side, his hand resting on the blaster at his waist. He was still on edge. The calm, calculating look on Lizara's face only deepened his sense of unease. She wasn't the same woman he had first met, the one who had seemed so distant, so cold. This was a woman who had seen the darker side of leadership, someone who understood that there were no easy answers. "We have a problem," she said, her voice firm, yet carrying an underlying weight of exhaustion. The room fell silent. "I don't believe the assassination attempt was a random act. There are forces at play here, forces who want to see this peace fail." Jackson watched as Lizara's gaze locked onto him. It wasn't just a glance, but a challenge. She was looking to him now, not as her husband, but as an ally in this fight. For the first time, he realized that she was no longer just a symbol of peace. She was fighting for her life, for her people, and for the future of the galaxy. "We need to uncover who's behind this," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "We cannot afford to wait. We need answers, and we need them now." Jackson nodded, his mind already racing through the possibilities. There were so many factions, so many enemies lurking in the shadows, but none of them had shown their cards yet. The truth was that the Zarian Empire had made plenty of enemies over the years, and many of those enemies had suffered as a result of Lizara's decisions. It would be nearly impossible to predict who would want her dead. But Jackson knew one thing for sure. This wasn't a game anymore. It was real, and the stakes were higher than they had ever been. As the meeting ended, Lizara turned to him. "Captain Riker, I'll need your help," she said, her voice softer now. "We need to uncover the truth, and we need to do it quickly. Trust no one, not even those closest to me." Jackson met her gaze, nodding without hesitation. He had come to understand that their survival wasn't just about protecting the peace anymore. It was about protecting each other, and perhaps, in the end, discovering something neither of them had expected. As they walked out of the meeting room together, the weight of their mission settled in both of their hearts. They were no longer just allies in a political scheme. They were partners in a fight for survival. And Jackson knew that the line between loyalty and betrayal was thinner than ever before. The palace had become a labyrinth of secrets and shadows. Captain Jackson Riker knew that time was running out. Every day that passed without answers only brought them closer to more danger. The attack on Lizara had been a warning, and he could feel it in his bones. Whoever was behind it wasn't going to stop. They would strike again, and the question was no longer if but when. Lizara had become even more guarded in the days following the attack. She no longer trusted anyone outside of a small select group, and Jackson had earned his place in that circle. Their bond, built on mutual survival, was growing stronger, though neither of them would admit it. But there was something else hanging in the air between them, a new sense of urgency, a shared understanding that they were in this together, no matter the cost. The mystery of who was behind the attack was consuming their every waking thought. Jackson and Lizara had begun to work in secret, poring over ancient texts, hidden reports, and intelligence from allies who were still loyal to the Zarian Empire. Each clue led to another dead end, another unanswered question. But the more they searched, the more they realized that the enemy wasn't just a single faction. It was a coalition, a shadow network of former allies and enemies alike, all working toward the same goal, the downfall of the Zarian Empire. One evening, after another long day of searching for leads, Lizara called for a private meeting with Jackson. She was sitting at a large round table in the quietest corner of the palace, her fingers tapping lightly on the edge as she stared into the distance. Her mind was sharp, her resolve unbroken. But Jackson could tell that the weight of this mystery was starting to break her. "We've been chasing ghosts," she said, her voice low but steady. "Everything we've looked at leads nowhere. But I don't believe that's coincidence." Jackson took a seat across from her. He had seen that same look in her eyes before, the quiet intensity that came when someone was on the verge of discovering something life-changing. He leaned forward slightly. "What are you thinking?" Lizara met his gaze, her expression hardening. "There's one person who could know everything, but getting to them won't be easy." Jackson raised an eyebrow. "Who?" Lizara's lips curled into a faint, bitter smile. "My brother, Prince Callan." Jackson was taken aback. He hadn't expected the mention of her family, especially not in such a context. He knew little about Prince Callan, except that he was a figure of controversy within the royal family. The stories of his ambitions, his charm, and his cunning were well known throughout the empire. If there was anyone who could be involved in a plot against Lizara, it was him. But why? And what did he stand to gain from it? "Callan," Jackson echoed. "Isn't he a traitor?" Lizara finished for him. Her tone was sharp. "It's a title he's earned, though not publicly. He's always had his eyes on the throne. And with the empire in turmoil, he might just think now is the perfect time to act." Jackson's mind was racing. If her brother was truly behind this, it would explain a lot. But why would he involve so many others in such a complex scheme? He'd always known that Lizara's position was precarious. But if this was a conspiracy at the highest level, it would be far more dangerous than they'd ever anticipated. "Do you think he's behind the attack?" Jackson asked, his voice low, almost fearful of the answer. Lizara's eyes darkened, her hand clenching into a fist on the table. "I don't know, but I'm not going to wait around and find out. If Callan is involved, I need to confront him before it's too late." Jackson knew that this would be a turning point. Confronting Prince Callan was risky, but it was the only lead they had. And as dangerous as it was, Jackson wasn't going to let Lizara face this alone. He had become more than just a soldier in this fight. He had become her ally, her protector, and perhaps, in time, something more. As they left the room to prepare for their next move, Jackson couldn't help but wonder how much more he would uncover about Lizara and about himself. There was something deeper between them now, a bond forged in the fires of danger and trust. But no matter how deep that bond went, one thing was clear: the empire was on the brink. And only the truth could save them. The walls of the palace felt like they were closing in on them. Princess Lizara knew that every moment spent inside the royal fortress was another moment wasted. Her brother, Prince Callan, was out there, somewhere, and she could feel his presence, his shadow looming over everything she had worked so hard to build. But she couldn't find him, not yet. The information they had gathered so far was only half a map, and the missing pieces were hidden deep within the labyrinth of lies, betrayal, and secrets that made up her family's history. Jackson Riker was standing by her side as they made their way down the dark corridors of the palace. He was more than just her protector now. He was her partner in this dangerous game. They had both decided that confronting Callan was the only way to move forward, but they knew it wouldn't be easy. The prince had many allies, some who had been with him for years, quietly pulling the strings behind the scenes. He had always been ambitious, his charm hiding a razor-sharp mind capable of twisting people to his will. And now, with the empire in chaos, it seemed like the perfect moment for him to strike. Their search for Callan took them outside the palace, into the dimly lit streets of Zaren's capital. The city was quiet, but there was a constant undercurrent of tension in the air. People spoke in whispers, glancing over their shoulders as if waiting for something terrible to happen. Jackson could feel the same unease settling in his chest. There were too many eyes watching them, too many unknowns. Every step they took brought them closer to the truth, but also closer to danger. As they entered a narrow alley, Lizara stopped, her eyes scanning the shadows. "This is where the information leads," she said quietly. "Callan's contacts, those still loyal to him, have been spotted here." Jackson glanced at her. He could see the determination in her face, but there was also something else. Fear, maybe. He couldn't tell. But there was no turning back now. "We go in, find what we need, and get out. Fast." The alley was silent except for the distant hum of the city. Jackson kept his hand near his blaster, ready for anything. Lizara walked with a calmness that belied the danger they were in. She wasn't just a princess here. She was a woman on a mission, and Jackson admired her for it. She had grown into someone he could trust, someone who no longer relied on her title to get by. She was strong, and that strength was starting to rub off on him. They reached the end of the alley, where a door stood partially ajar. Lizara gestured for Jackson to stay back as she stepped forward. Her hand reached out and knocked twice, the sound echoing in the stillness. Moments later, a figure appeared at the door, one of Callan's informants. He was thin, his face hidden in the shadows, but his eyes were sharp, calculating. "I'm here for the information," Lizara said without hesitation, her voice as commanding as ever. The man studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "You know what this means, don't you? If you're asking me, you're already in deeper than you realize." Jackson could feel the tension rising, but he kept his distance. This was Lizara's moment. He had seen her in command before, but this was different. This was personal. Lizara's eyes didn't waver. "I know exactly what it means. Now tell me where my brother is hiding, and I might spare your life." The informant chuckled softly, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. "You think Callan is hiding? He's always been in plain sight, Princess. The question is, where will you be when the truth finally comes to light?" Before Lizara could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed from behind them. Jackson turned just in time to see a group of armed men moving toward them, their faces hidden beneath dark hoods. They had been waiting for this moment, waiting to ambush them. Lizara reacted instantly, stepping back and drawing her own weapon. "Run," Jackson shouted, his hand pulling Lizara toward the nearby door. But it was too late. The alleyway had already been blocked off by the attackers. They were trapped. Lizara's heart raced, but she didn't hesitate. She had been prepared for this moment. "Stay close," she said, pulling out her blaster and taking aim. Jackson was right beside her, his own weapon drawn, ready for the fight that was coming. But as the attackers moved in, Jackson's mind raced. Who were these men? Were they sent by Callan? Or was this just another layer of the web they were caught in? One thing was certain. They weren't getting out of here without a fight. The alley was a battlefield. Jackson Riker's heart pounded as he glanced at Lizara, who stood firmly beside him, her eyes narrowing as the group of attackers closed in. They were outnumbered, but Jackson wasn't about to let them take her. He had sworn to protect the princess, and now, more than ever, that vow felt like his only purpose. Lizara's hand gripped her blaster tightly, her jaw set in determination. "We don't have time for this," she muttered under her breath. "We need to move." Before Jackson could respond, the first man lunged toward them. His face was hidden beneath a dark hood, but his movements were swift and practiced. Jackson reacted without thinking, using his combat training to dodge and strike in a fluid motion. The man hit the ground with a grunt, but there were more coming. The others weren't far behind, advancing with dangerous intent. Lizara fired her blaster, taking down one of the attackers in a quick, calculated shot. Her aim was precise, her expression unwavering, but Jackson could see the strain in her eyes. She wasn't just fighting for survival, she was fighting for something much bigger. Her empire, her people, and the truth that had eluded them for so long. "Keep moving," Jackson barked, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the back entrance of a nearby building. They had to escape. There was no time to waste. The attackers wouldn't give up, and if they stayed here, they would be trapped. They burst through the door and into a dimly lit hallway. The building was old, the walls lined with peeling paint, but Jackson wasn't concerned with the state of the place. They needed to find a way out, fast. He knew that if they didn't escape now, they wouldn't make it out of the city alive. Lizara was right behind him, her breathing steady despite the chaos they had just left behind. She moved with grace and precision, her mind clearly focused on the mission. "We need to get to the outskirts," she said, her voice firm. "There's a safe house there." Jackson didn't hesitate. He trusted her completely. "Lead the way." They moved quickly, darting through hallways and downstairs, staying out of sight of the attackers. Every footstep was calculated, every move deliberate. They had no room for mistakes. Jackson's mind raced as he tried to make sense of everything that had happened. Who were these men? Why were they after Lazara? And what did her brother, Prince Kalen, have to do with it? They reached a back door, and Jackson pushed it open, only to find themselves facing another set of armed men. This time, there were even more of them, and they had them cornered. "Not good," Jackson muttered under his breath. He quickly assessed the situation. There was no easy way out. They were trapped in this narrow alley, with no hope of escaping unnoticed. Lazara stepped forward, her expression unreadable. She wasn't afraid. "We don't have a choice," she said softly. "We fight." Jackson nodded. He knew that was the only option left. They had to fight their way out. "Stay close," he ordered. The battle was fierce. Blasters fired in quick succession, and Jackson moved with speed, taking down one attacker after another. But even as they fought, Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that they were being herded, that someone was pulling the strings from behind the scenes. The attackers weren't just aiming to capture them. They were trying to wear them down, push them into a corner where escape was impossible. Suddenly, the ground beneath their feet trembled. A rumble echoed through the street, and the air was filled with the sound of distant explosions. Lazara turned to Jackson, her eyes wide with realization. "It's a trap," she said. "They've blocked off the exits. We're not getting out." Jackson's heart sank. They were surrounded. The walls were closing in, and there was nowhere to run. He had to act fast. With a quick glance around, he spotted an old maintenance hatch near the side of the building. It was small, but it might be their only chance. "Over there," he said, pointing to the hatch. "We make a break for it. Now." Without waiting for an answer, Jackson bolted toward the hatch. Lazara followed closely behind, firing her blaster at the attackers who were hot on their heels. As they reached the hatch, Jackson yanked it open, and they both scrambled inside, narrowly avoiding a final barrage of blaster fire. The hatch slammed shut behind them, and the world outside went quiet. They were in a small underground passageway, their breaths heavy and ragged. Jackson leaned against the wall, trying to steady himself. They had escaped, but only just. Lazara didn't waste time catching her breath. "We're not safe yet," she said, her voice sharp. "We need to keep moving." Jackson nodded, his mind still racing. They had survived for now, but the danger wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The underground tunnel was cold and damp, but it offered a temporary refuge. Jackson Riker and Princess Lazara moved cautiously through the darkness, their footsteps echoing softly in the silence. Their breath was the only sound as they navigated the maze of narrow passageways. The danger was still fresh in their minds, but the immediate threat had passed, at least for now. Lazara walked ahead, her back straight, her mind already racing to the next step. They had escaped the trap, but they both knew this was far from over. The truth about her brother, Prince Kalen, was still elusive, and the more they uncovered, the more questions seemed to arise. Who was truly behind the attack on the palace? And what did Kalen have to do with it? Jackson stayed close behind, his hand resting on the hilt of his blaster. He couldn't help but feel a sense of urgency gnawing at him. Time was slipping away, and every second they spent hiding only brought them closer to the point of no return. If they didn't find Kalen soon, the consequences could be catastrophic. Eventually, they reached an old door at the end of the tunnel. Lazara paused and looked at Jackson, her expression serious. "This is it, the safe house I mentioned. It's where we'll regroup and plan our next move." Jackson nodded. "Let's hope it's still secure." The door creaked open as they entered the small, dimly lit room. Inside, a few scattered crates and old furniture lined the walls. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Lysara quickly moved to the far corner, where a table stacked with maps, data pads, and reports lay waiting. "We need to figure out where Callan is hiding," Lysara said, already scanning through the reports. "There's only one place he would go if he's planning something big." Jackson crossed the room and stood beside her. "The royal vaults." Lysara glanced up, her eyes flashing with resolve. "Exactly. If Callan is trying to seize control of the Empire, the vaults hold the key to everything. The royal artifacts, the ancient codes, the entire history of the Zerin Empire. If he can get his hands on them, he could have enough power to overthrow the throne." Jackson's mind raced. The royal vaults were heavily guarded, and for good reason. If Callan really was planning a coup, this would be the place to start. But it wasn't going to be easy to get there. They needed a plan, and they needed it fast. Lysara sat down at the table and began to work, her fingers flying across the datapad. Jackson watched her for a moment, admiring her determination. She was more than just a princess. She was a leader, a strategist, and she was ready to fight for everything she believed in. As she worked, Jackson's mind drifted back to the battle they had just escaped. They had come so close to being captured, so close to losing everything. And yet, through it all, Lysara had never hesitated. She had fought with everything she had, even when the odds were against her. He couldn't deny the respect he felt for her. In the midst of all this chaos, he had become more than just her protector. He had become her ally, her equal. And as much as he tried to push it out of his mind, he knew that what they shared was growing into something deeper, something more than just a mission. Lysara's voice broke through his thoughts. "I found it. Callan's plan. He's going to strike at the vaults tonight." Jackson's heart skipped a beat. "Tonight." She nodded, her face grim. "If we don't stop him now, the Empire could be lost." The urgency in her voice hit Jackson hard. There was no more time to waste. They had to move quickly. "We'll need help. We can't do this alone." Lysara stood up, her face set with determination. "I have allies in the city, loyal ones. We'll call in reinforcements, but we can't afford to wait. If Callan is already there, we'll need to get in, disable the defenses, and secure the vault before he can do any damage." Jackson's mind was already working through the logistics. It was going to be dangerous, but it was their only option. "Let's do it." With one last glance at each other, they made their way toward the exit. The night air was thick with tension as they stepped back into the streets of the city. They had one chance to stop Callan, and they weren't going to waste it. As they moved toward the royal vaults, Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that this final confrontation would change everything. It wasn't just about saving the Empire anymore. It was about the future, his future and Lysara's. And for the first time, Jackson wondered what that future might look like.